The folder hit the concrete a foot from her boots, and Colonel Wade Maddox let it lie there a second before he spoke. He'd thrown it underhand, almost gently, which was somehow worse than if he'd hurled it. Her qualification packet, her commendations, the after-action report with the redacted lines from Helmand, all of it fanned out across the asphalt in the gray light before sunrise. 26 candidates stood at attention and watched the pages settle. "Pick it up," Maddox said. He didn't raise his voice. He never did. She would learn. All of it. And while you're down there, take a good look at where you are. Sergeant First Class Della Vance did not move. He crossed the distance between them without hurry and stopped close enough that she could smell coffee and starch. When he spoke again, it was low, pitched for her alone, the way a man says a thing he wants no witnesses to. "I have washed out better soldiers than you for less. You won't make week 3. That's not a threat. I don't make threats. It's a forecast." What he could not have known, standing there in the cold with the desert going pink behind him, was that he had just started a clock he would spend the next 6 weeks failing to stop, and that when it finally ran out, the sound it made would carry 1,500 yards and rearrange everything he believed about himself. She bent, unhurried, and gathered the pages in order, Helmand on top. She squared the corners against her thigh, stood, and held the packet out to him. He didn't take it, so she tucked it under her arm and looked at a point just past his shoulder and waited, because waiting was the one thing she had always been better at than anyone around her. And she had a feeling she was going to need all of it. She had come up out of country she rarely talked about, the dry, high benchland east of the Wind River, where her father guided elk hunters in the fall and trapped a little in the winter and spent the rest of the year, as far as she could tell, watching weather. Asa Vance had been a ranger once, a long time before, in a war he mentioned maybe 4 times in his life, and never with any pride. He came home and he never really left the high country again. He taught her to shoot the way some men teach their kids to pray, not as a hobby, as a way of being in the world correctly. The first thing he taught her wasn't shooting at all. It was sitting still. She was 7, in a brush blind at the bottom of a coulee, and she had fidgeted, and he had put one hand flat on her knee and said, very quietly, "The animal can't hear your eyes." It took her years to understand what he meant. He meant that stillness was not the same as doing nothing. He meant that the woman who could hold position longer than the situation could would always, in the end, be handed the shot. He died when she was 31. In the front room of the house he'd built himself, in the chair that faced the window, so he could keep an eye on the ridge. It took 11 months, and it took most of what he was. But it never quite got the part of him that mattered. Near the end, when his voice had gone to almost nothing, he'd told her she already knew everything he had to teach. She just hadn't decided to trust it yet. She'd written 3 lines on the back of an old range card that night and folded it into the cover of his Bible, and she carried that card now in the left breast pocket of her blouse, the way other people carried photographs of the living. She was 34, 2 combat tours, a Purple Heart she didn't display, and a reputation that traveled ahead of her in a way she'd never asked for. She was good. Everyone who'd watched her shoot knew she was good. The trouble had never been the shooting. The course she had reported to was the Army's Advanced Long-Range Marksmanship Program, run out of a detachment in the southern desert that did not appear on most maps and answered, on paper, to people who answered to nobody. 41% of the men who started it didn't finish. Maddox told them that the first morning, after the packet was back under her arm, told it to them the way another man might read off the day's high temperature. The course owed them nothing, he said. Not fairness, not encouragement, not the benefit of any doubt. It owed them the truth about whether they could do the one thing the whole apparatus existed to find out, whether they could stay calm and stay still and put a single round exactly where it had to go while the world did everything in its power to make that impossible. He was looking at her when he said impossible. She'd noticed it, she'd file it, she filed everything. The first week was built to find the seam in a person and pry it open. No ramp, no easing in. They opened at full pressure and then went looking for ways past it. They ran the candidates into the ground before dawn and made them shoot with a heart rate the body did not want to give them. They stacked sleep loss on top of cognitive testing, on top of field problems that started in the dark and ended in the dark. Instructors barked contradicting orders just to watch who came apart when the orders stopped making sense. By the 3rd day, 2 men had quit and 1 had wrapped a tibia, and a 4th simply sat down on a rock in the middle of a night land nav lane and declined politely to stand back up. Vance was not unaffected. She would have been lying to herself to claim that, and she didn't lie to herself. That was a luxury she'd thrown out years ago as too expensive. She was tired in the deep way, the kind that lives under the muscle. She was cold in the desert mornings, in a way the afternoon heat never entirely burned off. But she had something the others didn't have in the same shape. When the outside got loud enough, she had somewhere inside to go. Her father had called it the back room, a space behind the noise that you built when you were young and the walls were still soft, so that later, when you needed it, the room was already there. From inside that room, she noticed the thing the other candidates were too gassed to notice. The instructors had patterns. Each of them leaned a particular way, escalated on a particular rhythm, had a tell for when the pressure was theater and when it was real. Maddox had a pattern too. He was hardest on her precisely when she was best, not at random. When she finished a problem first, when she put up a clean string, when she made something difficult look like it had cost her nothing. That was when the colonel found a reason to be standing over her shoulder, as though her competence were the specific thing that needed correcting. She set the observation down carefully alongside everything else and waited to learn what it was for. In the second week, she met Pike. He was 22, out of a stretch of East Tennessee so small, shared a post office with a church, a young soldier with a natural hand for fieldcraft and a problem he couldn't see his way around. He fell apart under a watching eye. Alone, his groups were tight enough to cover with a quarter. The second an instructor stepped behind him, his breathing climbed into his chest, and his trigger pull turned into a flinch, and his shots opened up like he'd never held a rifle in his life. Vance had had the exact same problem at 22 in her first long-range course, until a tobacco-stained old gunnery instructor named Marrow had looked at her targets and told her she shot like a person who was scared of being wrong. She had wanted to argue he'd been right. She found Pike on his lane at dusk after the training day had officially ended, running dry fire by himself in the failing light. She crossed the range without making a sound, which was a habit so old she'd stopped noticing she did it, and he jumped when she spoke. "You're fighting your own breath," she said. "When somebody's watching, you try to manage it instead of letting it do what it knows how to do. Your targets tell on you every time." He stared at her. He didn't know what to do with her, a woman he'd spent 2 weeks not quite trusting, handing him a diagnosis that landed like she'd been inside his head. "Your dad take you hunting?" she asked. He blinked. "Yes, ma'am. How'd you?" "Because you hold at the bottom like a deer hunter holds. It's right for 40 yards. It's wrong for 1,000. A shooter at distance doesn't hold the breath. He finds the still place at the end of the exhale, the gap before the next one, and the shot happens inside that gap. There's a difference between owning your breathing and wrestling it." He looked down at his rifle a long moment. "Why are you telling me this?" It was a fair question. In a course where 4 in 10 went home, helping the man next to you survive cut against your own numbers. "Because that's not how I was raised," she said, and left him to it. The next morning, his groups closed up by a third. His instructor, a quiet sergeant first class named Okafor, noticed and said nothing. But the way he didn't say it was its own kind of remark. And word moved the way it always moves through a small group under hard pressure, fast, quiet, and more accurate than the people it concerned would have liked. The trouble found her on a Thursday, and it found her first in the rifle. She caught it during the morning 1,000-yard string. Her cold bore round printed 2 inches high. Fine, cold bores do that. But the second was high too, and the third low, and the fourth back up, and the spread had no honesty to it. Wind makes a consistent lie. You can read a lie that holds still. This was vertical stringing with no rhythm, and vertical stringing with no rhythm is not weather. It's the rifle. It's a thing that's been done to the rifle. She finished the string without letting any of it reach her face, passed, and that night she pulled the action out of the stock under the bunk light and ran a hand along the bedding and found it. The rear action screw backed out a precise quarter turn. Not loose enough to rattle. Not loose enough that a fast check would catch it. Just loose enough to let the receiver walk under recoil and throw her elevation in a way no amount of skill could correct. You had to torque it to find it. You had to already suspect. She held the rifle in her lap for a while in the dark. Then she set the screw to spec, marked the witness line with a paint pen so she'd know next time at a glance, and went to chow. She told no one, not because she didn't have a suspicion strong enough to be called a conviction, but an accusation without proof, in a place that was already hunting for reasons to doubt her, was a weapon that fired backward. Her father had a phrase for it, Bleed where they can't see you. Not because the wound was shameful, but because blood draws the wrong kind of attention. So she bled in private, and she waited. The score came for her the following week. She finished the unknown distance stalk with the highest raw line in the class, a combined number off her approach, her concealment, her final firing position, and her hit probability at ranges that hadn't been disclosed beforehand. She knew the number because she kept her own book, a habit going back years, a parallel record she ran alongside the official one, out of an instinct she'd never had to justify until now. When the board went up, she was eighth. The note beside her line cited tradecraft deviations that appeared on no one else's card and matched no rubric she'd ever been handed. Staff Sergeant Knox had stalked behind her that day. He came and stood at the board next to her and read it and read her line, and something crossed his face that wasn't the smugness she'd have expected from him. "That's wrong," he said quiet. Knox had been one of the louder doubters early, not cruel, just certain, in the way of men who've never had their certainty cost them anything. "I was behind you the whole approach. Your stalk was cleaner than mine. I'm not saying that to be nice. I'm saying it because it's what I watched happen. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her since she'd arrived." "I know," she said. "What are you going to do about it?" She looked at the board a moment longer. "Keep shooting." She filed a formal discrepancy through the chain anyway, not because she thought it would move the number, but because she understood that paper is its own kind of ammunition. A record sits there. Records have a way of mattering later, in ways you can't always see when you're making them. 2 days later, Maddox called her to his office. Small room, a desk, 2 chairs, 1 window that looked straight out at the firing line. He was standing at the window when she came in, his back to her, and he let her stand at attention long enough that the standing became part of whatever he was about to say. He turned. "You filed a discrepancy." "Yes, sir. You're aware I review every performance document in this course." "Yes, sir." He sat. He laced his fingers. "I've looked at your stalk again. The methodology was applied consistently. Some deviations don't show up in raw numbers. Experienced evaluators see things the score doesn't capture." "With respect, sir," she said, "I'd like to know exactly which deviations were observed and whether they were written down in real time or after my composite was already calculated." Something moved behind his eyes, not anger. She'd have known anger. This was quieter and harder to name. "Are you accusing me of something, Sergeant?" "No, sir. I'm asking a procedural question. What was seen and when was it recorded?" Those seem like fair questions about a score that dropped my standing 7 places. The silence had weight to it. He let it sit. "You're standing further out on a limb than you think you are," he said at last. "Yes, sir. I'm aware of that." He dismissed her. She walked out into the dry evening, and for 30 seconds, no more, she let herself feel the things she hadn't shown him. Not the anger so much as the exhaustion under it, the specific grinding tiredness of being plainly the best in the room and still having to fight for the right to be called adequate. 30 seconds. Then she went back and cleaned a rifle that didn't need cleaning, because the ritual was the only thing in the building that always told her the truth. He didn't let it go. 3 days later, he called a full assembly at 5 in the morning, the whole class in formation in the dark, breath smoking. Nobody told why. "We have a candidate in this program," Maddox said, who filed a formal complaint about her scores. He didn't say her name. He didn't need to. Every eye that wasn't fixed to the front cut toward her for exactly 1 second and snapped back. "In 19 years of running these courses," he went on, in that flat carry that was somehow worse than shouting, "I have never had a candidate question the integrity of the evaluation. Not once. You want to know why? Because the people who get selected for this understand something. This course does not owe you a good number. It owes you the truth. And the truth is that some of you standing here right now do not have it, and no amount of paperwork changes that." He stopped in front of her. "Are we clear, Sergeant Vance?" "Yes, sir." "Level. Nothing in it." He held the pause 3 full seconds, a performance staged for the 25 men watching, and then he walked away. What he didn't see, because his back was already turned, was Knox. Knox, 2 men down the line, watching the colonel go, then turning his head a few degrees to look at Vance with an expression that had traveled a long way in 3 weeks. Not pity. Knox wasn't built for pity. Something nearer to recognition. A man who just watched something crooked happen and knew it, even if he didn't yet know what he meant to do about it. She felt the look and didn't return it. Eyes front, face still. She set the moment down beside the others. The pressure on Knox's conscience finished its work the next week, and it finished in public. Week 5 brought the protocol the cadre called compound stress. Physical and psychological load stacked deliberately on top of each other to see who came apart when the two multiplied. The candidates ran a kit-laden obstacle course, transitioned straight to a timed precision string with no recovery, and got pulled into a panel interview where instructors fired questions about the string they'd just shot, while a monitor read their stress indicators. It was a legitimate tool. Snipers work in conditions where the bodies panic and the minds panic, feed each other, and the course genuinely needed to know who that broke and who it didn't. But for Vance, the implementation had a wrinkle. She found out the way she found out most things, by catching the detail that didn't fit. During the physical phase, she was routed through a sand wash. The others weren't. She didn't realize it until she was already in it, a stretch of loose ground that added the better part of 4 minutes to her time and cost her the transition window that mattered. She reached the firing line with the clock already eating her. She set up faster than she had ever set up in her life and put 5 of 6 on steel in the time that was left. The 6th was still rotating up when the buzzer went. 5 of 6 under deliberately fouled conditions. A pass. Not her number. In the interview, a captain she'd never dealt with, which was itself worth noting, asked her, with the careful ease of a man working off a script, whether she thought her result reflected what she was actually capable of that day. No, she said. Why not? Because my route through the physical phase was different from everyone else's in a way that ate my transition time, which ate my engagement window, which ate my score. He set his pen down. That's a significant allegation, Sergeant. It's an observation. I'm happy to walk you through both routes. I memorized both. A pause. Both? I noticed during the walkthrough this morning that my route marker was set different from the standard lane, so I memorized both in case the difference turned out to matter. A longer pause. He closed his notebook. I see. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Knox had taken a photograph of those 2 route markers during that same walkthrough because he thought it was a mistake and meant to ask her about it. And the next morning, Knox didn't ask her quietly. He came into the common bay where 8 other candidates were sitting and held up his phone where they could all see it and said, loud enough that he clearly meant it to carry, I want to show you something. 2 routes. One for everyone. One that ran her through the wash. I thought it was a paperwork error, he said. Then the protocol happened, and I did the math. He put the phone in his pocket. I'm taking this to Okafor. You can come or not. But I'm going. Turned and walked out. For a second, nobody moved. Then a ranger named Driscoll, who'd said maybe 10 words to her in 5 weeks, stood up, picked up his coffee, and said to no one, I'll go too, and followed him. What happened in the instructor's office was not dramatic. There was no shouting, no scene. Okafor looked at the photograph for a long time. He asked a few flat questions. He photographed the photograph with his own phone. He thanked them and told them to get back to the bay. And the look on his face as they left was the look of a man doing arithmetic he didn't like the sum of. Maddox called her in that evening, and she'd braced for the anger, the way you brace for a wave you can see coming. What she got instead was a man who looked, for the first time since she'd met him, tired. Not from the day, the other kind. The kind that comes from carrying a thing a long way without setting it down. He didn't speak for almost half a minute. Then, the route variance has been logged as an administrative error. Your protocol score will be recalculated against the standard window. The corrected score reflects a full 6 of 6. She said nothing. He looked at her, and for the first time he wasn't looking at a problem to be managed. He was looking at a person, the way one person looks at another when the wall between them has cracked without either of them meaning it to. Anything you want to say? No, sir, he nodded slowly, as if that answer, that exact, controlled, withheld answer, had confirmed something he'd suspected. Dismissed. In the hall outside, she put her back to the wall and shut her eyes for 10 seconds. Just 10. And in those 10 seconds, she let herself feel the full freight of what 5 weeks had cost her. Not in points, not in standing, but in the plain grinding fuel it had taken to stay whole, while the whole apparatus was tuned to break her. Then she opened her eyes and walked back to the bay, because there was still a final phase ahead of her. And out in a basin 300 miles north, there was a slab of steel that had been hanging untouched for 28 years, and she had every intention of being the one to ring it. The last days at the home range produced something she hadn't built and couldn't have asked for. The candidates who'd been giving her a wide berth at Chow started sitting closer. Questions that used to go to Okafor or to the cadre started coming quietly to her. A recon Marine on loan named Beckett, who'd spent 5 weeks holding a careful neutrality that was its own kind of verdict, came to her before a night stalk and said, "What would you watch for on this approach?" "You don't have to answer," she answered. He listened the way serious people listen, with more than his ears. He posted the best time in the class and afterward found her and said, "Simply, it worked." She said she knew. He asked how she'd known before she knew. She thought about it and said because her father had taught her the same thing and it had worked for her too, which was the truest answer she had. Okafor watched all of it from a distance. He'd served beside Maddox 11 years and knew him better than most men know their oldest friends. And what he saw on the colonel's face those last days, watching the class fold itself quietly around the one candidate he'd spent 5 weeks trying to expel, was something he hadn't seen on Maddox in a very long time. The look of a man beginning to doubt a story he'd been telling himself for years. Okafor didn't say anything about it. He was a patient man. Some things show themselves in their own time and can't be rushed. The convoy north pulled out at 4 in the morning. 17 left from 26. 2 quits, 2 medical, 2 performance cuts, and one who'd simply stopped answering anyone and had been quietly removed before it had to be made official. Nobody talked much on the road. Soldiers go a particular kind of quiet before something that's going to matter, the quiet of people waiting on a verdict. The basin had a name the cadre used, and the maps didn't, the Cauldron. A wide bowl of broken ground, walled on 3 sides by rimrock. The desert had spent a few million years carving without any thought for what men would eventually try to do down in it. The slab hung at 1,500 yards. A steel plate the original range crew had bolted up as a theoretical ceiling, the farthest, hardest shot they could imagine that still sat inside the envelope of physics and human skill, and then, by every account, never expected anyone to make. Maddox gathered them on the rim the second morning, his back to the bowl, the sky behind him, 17 faces in front, the wind cutting through all of it. He had a way of setting himself against the landscape that was almost theatrical, and the fact that he did it without seeming to think about it told you he'd been doing it a long time. "In 28 years, he said, this course has run better than 600 candidates through this basin. Every qualifying class shoots the slab on the last day. Every qualifying class goes home without a hit. That is not an insult to any of them. Those were exceptional shooters, and a good number of them are out in the world right now, doing things this country will never hear about. The shot isn't impossible because those men weren't good enough. It's impossible because this bowl does something to the wind that no standard correction can fully account for." He paused. Then, almost like an afterthought, except nothing he said was an afterthought, he looked straight at her. "The physics say so." Just that, and moved on to the schedule. Pike fell into step beside her on the walk down. "That was aimed at you. I know. Does it get to you?" She considered it honestly. "It turns something on. Whether that's any use depends on what I do with it." That evening, after the formal day ended, she went back to the basin alone. Not to the line, not to the slab. She climbed to a point on the rim above and between the two, and she sat down on the rock and she watched. She watched for 2 hours. The wind in the bowl did not behave the way open ground wind behaved. She'd known that from the briefing, but reading it on paper and seeing it were different things. The rim rock pinched the air and threw it and folded one current into another. And at the surface, down on the line, the flag showed you one tidy story, while the truth was a great deal more complicated. From above, watching what the dust did, and the brittle grass, and the way the heat shimmer over the bottom climbed and leaned and broke, she could see the surface red for what it was, a rough average of something that was not, in fact, average at all. Her father had told her once, on a ridge above a valley in Wyoming, with the light going long, that the best thing a shooter could do was watch the same piece of ground at different hours, because the ground never changed, but your understanding of it kept getting deeper. So she watched. And 40 minutes in, she saw it for the first time. A thing happening down in the bottom of the bowl that the flag simply could not show her. The thermal over the basin floor wasn't holding steady. It built and it leaned, and at a certain point it detached. The column broke loose of the ground and tumbled downwind, and for a moment, a short, clean moment, the air over the slab went slack. The boil in the mirage flattened. The lean came out of it. Then a new column began to build, and the whole thing started over. She started counting. She watched it break and counted to the next break. A little over a minute. She watched again. A little over a minute. She counted it 9 more times in the failing light, and the interval held. Call it 70 seconds. Give or take the slop that air temperature would put into it as the evening cooled, and that slop was itself predictable by the clock. This was not chaos. This was not the unreadable thing Maddox had stood on the rim and called the physics. This was a rhythm, buried, subtle, but a rhythm. And rhythms have answers. Her pulse climbed maybe 10 beats, and she brought it back down on purpose. Nothing was solved yet. She'd found a variable, not a solution. She needed to know what that slack window did to a round in flight across 1,500 yards. She needed the bullet's time aloft. She needed to know how long the flat held once it started, whether it was a door she could put a round through or just a thing to watch. She sat on the rim and did the math in her head for another hour. And when she finally walked down, it was full dark, and the temperature had dropped 20 degrees. Okafor was outside the ops shack, the only man on the detachment who still smoked, doing it with the unapologetic devotion of someone who'd made his peace with it. He watched her come up out of the dark from the direction of the basin, and he didn't ask where she'd been. He just watched her pass and finished his cigarette. The third day was the final qualifying block, and she finished first overall by a margin that made the men checking the log check it twice. Okafor ran the numbers, then had Halloran, the master sergeant who'd been spotting on the detachment longer than anyone, run them again separately. Halloran looked at the figures, looked at Okafor, and said nothing, which from Halloran was a paragraph. Word went through the bay like fire through cheatgrass. Knox stood in the middle of it and said to anyone in earshot, which was everyone, she finished first, by 11 points. Somebody started a slow clap that lasted maybe 4 seconds before discipline took it back, but 4 seconds was a declaration. Pike sat on his rack, grinning and not bothering to hide it. Vance heard all of it and said nothing, but her hands just for a moment went still over the rifle because she was letting herself feel the weight of it. She thought about a folded range card in the cover of a Bible on a shelf in Wyoming. One promise left. Halloran carried the scores to Maddox personally that night, which wasn't protocol, which meant he'd done it on purpose so he'd be in the room. She finished first, Halloran said. I can read, by 11 points, and she went to the basin last night. After hours, 2 hours, alone on the rim, just watching. I could see her from the shack. Maddox was quiet a while. The shot is impossible. You've been saying that 12 years because it's true. Halloran looked at his colonel. He'd served beside this man a long time, and he knew where the hardness came from. Not all of it, but the shape of it. He knew about the daughter, not the details, the shape. Sir, he said carefully, I think you should watch her shoot tomorrow. Really watch? Not as the man grading it. He paused, as somebody who might have been wrong. The silence ran long. Maddox didn't answer. But the score sheet stayed on his desk after Halloran left, and he sat with it a long time, looking at the number 11, the way a man looks at something quietly moving the furniture of his certainties around in the dark. The last morning came in with the particular stillness of days that already know they're going to count. 17 candidates on the line, the bowl falling away in front of them, the slab 1,500 yards out and invisible to the naked eye, hanging exactly where it had hung for 28 years. One shot each. The instructors weren't there to coach. They were there to watch and to confirm if the thing that didn't happen finally happened. The first man up was a ranger named Sandoval, top 5 in the class, technically flawless. He read it, dialed it, fired, drifted left. The bowl ate it. The second man missed high, into the rimrock above the plate. The third missed. By the sixth miss, the air on the line had gone heavy and collective, because these were not bad shots. These were superb shots, under conditions that were simply winning. Knox was ninth. He spent 45 seconds on his read, dialed, fired, and put his round into the canyon wall 12 feet under the slab. He stood up, looked through his spotter, said one word nobody repeated, and then said to Vance, 2 positions down the line. The wind in the bottom third is doing something the flags aren't showing. I know, she said. He looked at her. Something settled in his face. You figured it out. Last night, I think so. He held her eyes a moment. Then go ring it, he said, rough and direct, the way Knox said the few things he actually meant. 10 through 16 shot in sequence. One came close. Beckett, whose round passed inside 2 feet before the bowl claimed it, and then there was one shooter left. Maddox stepped forward. His voice carried the length of the line, over all 17, over the cadre, over the wind, moving through everything. No one makes that shot, he said. Not today, not ever. He looked straight at her. The physics say so. She didn't look at him. She didn't look at the slab or the flags that had already beaten 16 men this morning. She lowered herself behind the rifle, and the whole loud, complicated world she'd been fighting through for 6 weeks went quiet. Not silent. Quiet. The difference was the whole thing. Silence was an absence. Quiet was a decision, a discipline, a back room her father had built in her young enough that it had set like architecture instead of staying memory. Halloran took the spotting scope behind her left shoulder. He'd spotted hundreds of candidates in this bowl. His face gave away nothing, but his right hand, resting on his knee, had closed into a loose fist he didn't know he'd made. The first thing Halloran noticed was that she didn't go to the glass. Every other shooter had gone straight to the scope, instinct, reaching for the thing you trust when you need to know. She was looking at the basin with her own eyes, watching. He understood all at once what she'd been doing on that rim the night before, and his hand tightened. She was counting. She'd started her count off the last detachment she'd watched before settling in, and she was holding it against the rhythm she'd clocked the evening before. She found the slab in the scope, small at that distance, but not impossible. She'd shot dimensions like it, at ranges like it for years. She took a breath, let it go, found the still place at the bottom of it, the window her father had called the quiet second, and she didn't fire. She let the window pass and took the next breath. A full minute went by. Long, not disqualifying, but long enough that a couple of candidates traded looks. Down the line, Pike's hands weren't shaking. 3 days ago, on the road, he'd told her. They shook from the waiting. He wasn't waiting now. He was watching, and the difference had quietly remade him. She was counting because she wasn't shooting at the slab. She was shooting at the slack. At the moment, the column down in the bottom let go and tumbled off, and the air over the plate went flat and honest for a handful of seconds. The bullet would be in the air close to 2 full seconds at this range. She needed to release, so the round arrived inside the flat, not on the way into it and not on the way out. And that meant she had to fire a beat before the window opened and let the math carry the rest. Her father, on a ridge in Wyoming, 20 years gone. You don't beat the conditions you can't control. You wait for the moment they hand you what you need, and you're ready when they do. She was ready. She felt it more than saw it. The basin gathering itself to exhale. The single hawk that had been working the thermal over the slab quit circling and tipped onto a different line. The boil and the mirage began at the edges to lie down. Her finger came onto the trigger, not pressing, just touching. The start of a conversation. The shimmer flattened into the sheep she'd spent 2 hours on that rim learning to recognize. There it was. She didn't think. Thinking had been for the preparation. This part was trust. She fired. The crack went out across the bowl and came back off both walls at once and rolled away into the high rock. The round was already gone, already invisible, already somewhere in the 1,500 yards of moving air between the line and the slab. Nobody breathed. Halloran had the plate centered, 1 second, a second and a half, 2, and then faint and clean and impossible, riding back up out of the bowl a full 2 seconds behind the shot, a single ringing note. Steel struck square. The sound of a plate that had hung silent for 28 years finally being hit by a round sent exactly where it was meant to go. For the first time in his career, Halloran pulled his eye off the glass, mid, and looked at Okafor, who was staring back at him with his mouth open. Dead center, Halloran said. Flat, controlled. Because if he let any of what he was feeling into it, it would come out as something a master sergeant has no business saying on a live line. Then the line came apart. Pike made a sound that wasn't a word, both hands on top of his head. Driscoll said, "Holy God," with total sincerity. Beckett sat straight down on the ground where he stood, as though his legs had reached a decision the rest of him hadn't signed off on. And Knox, the first voice of doubt, 6 weeks back on the asphalt, turned away from the bowl and put a hand over his mouth and stood there a second with his back to all of it, and nobody looked at him, which was the right call. Vance was still behind the rifle. She hadn't moved. Then she stood, stepped back off the line, turned, and looked across the faces of 16 men who were looking at her. And then she looked at Maddox. He was standing exactly where he'd been when he'd said not ever. He hadn't moved since the note came back. His arms were at his sides, and whatever was on his face was happening at a depth that hadn't been touched in a long time. It wasn't anger. It was past anger. It was the thing anger turns into when it finally runs out of air, the thing that had been underneath the whole time. Using the anger as a wall. Halloran cleared his throat. Confirmed hit, he called, loud, formal, the way it gets said. Center mass, round 1. Nobody cheered, not right away. It takes a moment for something genuinely, without precedent, to find the right shelf in a person's head. It was Pike who started it. Single spaced claps, more a standing ovation than a celebration. Then Driscoll, then Beckett, then Okafor, who set his clipboard down and clapped like he no longer cared what was appropriate. Then Knox turned back around now, one hard two-handed clap from a man acknowledging without a speech that he'd changed his mind about something important. It built and ran the length of the line. Maddox didn't clap, but he didn't look away either. She let it wash over her exactly 5 seconds. Then she slung the rifle and walked 20 feet off and took the worn range card out of her left breast pocket and held it and looked at it, at her father's 3 lines in her own hand. And she didn't read them because she knew them better than her own pulse. Maddox came and stood 10 feet off and waited, in the uncharacteristic way of a man with something to say and no idea how to start it. "How long were you up there?" he said finally. "On the rim. 2 hours, sir. You found the cycle?" "Yes, sir." He was quiet. "Nobody's ever done that. 28 years. Nobody has gone up there and watched long enough to find it." He looked out at the bowl. "I pulled the original range file this morning. The crew that built this noted that thermal. They wrote that it was too irregular to use." He paused. "They were wrong. They weren't watching the right thing," she said. He looked at her, and something landed. "No," he said, "they weren't." The bowl sent a low sound across the distance, wind through rock, older than anyone standing there. Then he said, "My daughter's name was Nora." She went still. "She wanted to fly," he said, and his voice had stopped being the instrument of authority it had been for 6 weeks. "Combat, aviation, best athlete in the family by a mile. I told her she wasn't going to make it. I told her to save herself the heartbreak. She made it anyway. First in her class. And then she went down in a training flight 8 months later, and I have spent every day since deciding that the thing that killed her was the door I should have kept her from walking through." He stopped, collected himself. "So I made it my job to stand in those doors, to keep the next one from getting taken apart the way I told myself Nora was. I told myself that was protection." He looked at her directly. "I was wrong about what protection is, and about what it costs when you decide that for somebody else, instead of letting them decide it for themselves." It was the most she'd ever heard him say in a single breath that had nothing to do with the course. "I'm sorry about Nora," she said. "I mean that." "I know you do," he said. The wind moved through the bowl again. "Your father taught you to look," he said. "He taught me how to look," she said. "What I did with it was mine." And for the first time since she'd reported, Colonel Wade Maddox, the man who'd thrown her packet on the ground, backed out her action screw, downgraded her stalk, routed her through the wash, and put himself between her and every door she'd tried to walk through, looked at her with no wall up at all. "Sergeant Vance," he said, "that's the finest single shot I've witnessed in 19 years of doing this." "Thank you, sir." He nodded once, clean, and turned and walked back toward the ops shack, and his walk was the same as it had always been. The walk of a man who carries authority in his posture without performing it. But the set of his shoulders had changed, maybe 3 degrees, not much. About the difference, at 1,500 yards, between a clean miss and dead center. The graduation was the next morning, in the main hall, a functional room arranged with just enough formality to say the thing mattered without overstating it. Word had traveled the way that kind of word travels. And there were senior officers in the room from 3 branches, which was unusual for a course at that classification, and which said something without saying it. Halloran told her in the hallway beforehand that a 1-star named Ames had specifically asked to be present, not for the graduation, for her. He didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. When they called her name, the room changed its own atmosphere, the way a room does when a thing it has been collectively holding gets released at once. General Ames stood, and then Halloran stood, and Okafor, and the candidates, all 16 of them, and the families in the back, who didn't have the full context but understood that something was happening. Knox was on his feet before the applause caught, standing straight, clapping with both hands, the face of a man proud to be in the room. Pike, in the line of graduates, was not entirely managing to keep his face military, and that was all right. After the formal part, when the room loosened into the reception, Maddox crossed it with purpose and stopped in front of her, and took a small official envelope out of his breast pocket and held it in both hands, which is not how a man holds an envelope unless he's decided it weighs more than paper. "Battlefield promotion recommendation," he said. "Signed this morning. Mine, and a personal commendation for the highest score in the history of this program." He held it out, not as charity, not as politics, as respect. "Earned 1 round at a time over 6 weeks by the best shooter I have ever trained." She took it. She looked at him. What changed? He was quiet a moment. I told you about Nora. What I didn't tell you is that 2 weeks before that flight, she asked me whether I thought she belonged there. And I told her I didn't know. His jaw tightened once. I have never forgiven myself for that answer. And somewhere in there I turned it into everyone else's problem. He looked at her steadily. That's not an excuse. It's an explanation. There's a difference. I know there is, she said. I spent 6 weeks trying to make you quit. You didn't. And it wasn't stubbornness, and it wasn't pride. It was that you had something worth staying for. So did Nora, she said gently. Something crossed his face, fast and private and very deep. Yes, he said. She did. He straightened and shook her hand and held it one beat past formal, and in that beat was everything that didn't have words. That night, after the reception and the processing and the careful business of people, figuring out how to say goodbye without making it too large, she went back to the empty bay and sat on the edge of her rack and took out a small journal she'd carried since the funeral. She opened it to the page she'd opened 1,000 times. Her father's 3 lines, copied in her own hand the night she buried him. Serve with honor, never quit, become the shooter they said you couldn't be. She took a pen and held it over the 3rd line, a long moment. Then she drew a single check beside it. She sat with that for a while. The fullness of it, the weight and the relief and the grief and the gratitude all occupying the same space at once, the way the large things do when you finally stop managing them. And then she cried quietly, the way private grief looks when it's complete. For her father, for Nora Maddox, who had asked the wrong person whether she belonged and gotten the wrong answer. For every woman who'd stood at a door and been told by the shape of the room that the door wasn't hers. For the girl in the brush blind at the bottom of a coulee who didn't know yet what the world was going to ask of her, and had a man beside her with a spotting scope, teaching her to read what was actually there. When she was done, she closed the journal and put the card back over her heart and sat up straight and breathed. There was a thing her father had said once, on that Wyoming ridge, when she was 12 and furious that a shot she'd drilled all week still wouldn't group. He'd put a hand on her shoulder and told her that good shooters hit targets, but that wasn't really what any of it was about. She'd asked him what it was about then. He'd looked at the mountains in a while. Good ones change what people think is possible, he'd said. She'd been 12 and hadn't understood it. She understood it now. And in the years after, every woman who came through that pipeline heard the story before she ever fired in the Cauldron. The cadre told it, but more often it was the ones who'd been there. Knox told it at every leadership course he ever attended, with the particular credibility of a man who'd started out on the wrong side of it and said so to your face. Pike told it the way people tell the things that remade them, and it always ended the same way. A basin nobody could read, a slack window 70 seconds wide that nobody had bothered to sit still long enough to find. One breath, one round, dead center. And the steel ringing back up out of the bowl 2 full seconds late the way it still rings. If you go out there on the rim and wait and listen, the way a man on a Wyoming ridge once taught his daughter to wait and to listen before the world had any idea what she was about to become.